They say the mountains of Montana keep their secrets buried in ice and silence. But in the winter of 1876, one secret clawed its way out, dripping in blood and shame. Imagine a cabin so remote that no smoke could be seen for miles, no voices heard but the wind, and yet, inside, something ancient and unspeakable was taking shape. This wasn't the madness of frontier life, nor the tragedy of poverty. No, this was the result of a century-long pact, written not in ink, but in flesh. And for those who kept it, mercy meant murder. I have seen records, hidden for decades, that tell the story of the Donnelly family, an Irish bloodline that did not merely survive isolation, but used it as a shield for practices so coldly calculated they would shame even the most ruthless of men. The official histories speak of hardship, famine, and migration, but they omit the truth that the Donnellys came to Montana not to build a new life, but to continue an old experiment, one that began far across the ocean in the green hills of County Cork, under skies heavy with winter and sign. The man who would stumble upon their secret was Dr. Theodore Brennan, a physician trained in the sophisticated halls of Vienna, Berlin, and Edinburgh. He came west not for gold, not for adventure, but to escape scandal. His peers whispered of his troubling interest in heredity, his belief that bloodlines could and should be improved through selection. In Montana's lawless edge of civilization, he could pursue his theories in peace. He had no idea that somewhere in those mountains lived a family who had already been running their own breeding program for 5 generations. The Montana Territory of the mid-1870s was an expanse of law and hunger. Outside Helena, the capital, there was nothing but mining camps, frozen rivers, and settlers who disappeared without question. Here no one cared who you were or what you did as long as you kept to your land. It was a perfect hiding place for those fleeing the reach of the civilized world. And in September 1874, Patrick Donnelly, his wife Bridge, and their 4 children arrived in Helena with unusual precision. Their crates were packed like military cargo, their gold coins heavy and too clean for farmers fleeing famine. Patrick claimed he'd been a potato farmer, but his hands bore no calluses, his fingers instead ink-stained, his speech educated. The locals noted Bridge's strange manner, her eyes darting, her voice a trembling whisper. She clutched her children close, as if the open air itself might steal them away. Every transaction was paid in gold, counted and recounted, each coin parted with reluctance. Beneath her civility was the look of a woman who had stared too long into some private abyss. What no one knew then was that the Donnellys were running from more than famine. Back in Ireland, a parish priest had threatened to expose what he called an abomination against God and nature in their family. His letter never meant for public eyes warned Patrick that if they did not leave immediately, he would see to it that all of County Cork learned the truth of their bloodline purity and the sins that cry out to heaven for vengeance. The land Patrick purchased lay deep between 2 mountain ridges, accessible only by a treacherous trail that vanished entirely under winter snow. No smoke from their chimney could be seen by neighbors. Their water source froze solid half the year. It was not a homestead, it was a fortress of privacy. The cabin was built with knowledge beyond frontier skill. Thick, heat-holding walls, small windows, partitions that could be sealed off in the coldest months. They stored food and preserved meat with mathematical precision, and every detail of their life suggested a family accustomed to enduring winters far more brutal than Montana. Yet those who crossed their path noticed oddities. The family's faces were 2 similar pale blue eyes, angular bones, long fingers as though they'd been carved from the same block of marble. The children were intelligent, disciplined, but wary, like animals trained to obey under threat. They spoke of keeping the line pure and the strength that comes from proper breeding in tones too rehearsed to be passing remarks. These were not the thoughts of simple farmers. They were the doctrines of something older, something deliberate. In March of 1875, as the thaw opened the trails after 6 months of complete isolation, the first crack in their facade appeared. Jake Harrison, the mail carrier, arrived to find signs of recent repair boards covering damage, fresh earth dug in the frozen ground. And then there was the smell. Sweet, decayed, the unmistakable scent of death lingering in the cold air. Inside, Bridge was in labor, attended only by her daughter Moira. The infant that emerged was malformed, its spine warped, its arm twisted, its skull too large. Harrison, horrified, offered to fetch a doctor, but Patrick refused. His pale eyes were hard, his voice chilling in its calm. Some children aren't meant for this world. It's God's mercy. When Harrison returned 2 weeks later, the baby was gone. Bridge told him with dry eyes, buried behind the cabin, next to the others. Behind the house stood 4 small graves, each marked with a cross identical in size and shape, as if they had been prepared in advance. It was not grief that hung over that ground. It was the efficiency of a family enacting a plan. From then on, Harrison watched closely. He heard them speak in Irish of the weak ones and how to handle the imperfect. He noticed the girls' haunted eyes, the boys' nervous silences. And when winter closed in again, he knew that whatever happened in that cabin during the long dark months was not meant for the eyes of the living. What Harrison didn't know was that in those same months, miles away in Helena, Dr. Brennan was beginning to hear whispers of the Donnelly family, and what he would eventually discover would change the meaning of the word family forever. By February of 1876, the mountain passes to the Donnelly homestead were sealed under snow, and no sane rider would attempt the journey. But in the dim back room of his office in Helena, Dr. Theodore Brennan was piecing together a puzzle from fragments immigration records, whispered reports from Jake Harrison, and scattered files from distant counties. The more he read, the more the Donnelly name became a shadow that reached across states, across decades, always accompanied by the same trail of suspicion. Too many infant graves, too many sudden relocations, too many questions answered with silence. Harrison had brought him strange tailies from the winter mountains lights, glowing in the Donnelly cabin at hours when fuel should be rationed. Eerie singing that rose and cut off suddenly. Figures moving outside in blizzard conditions. Brennan, trained to strip away superstition, could not explain these accounts in simple medical terms. The pattern was too deliberate. There was purpose behind their secrecy. He began with the immigration records. Patrick and Bridge Donnelly had claimed 3 years' residence in Brooklyn before heading west, but Brennan's inquiries revealed no trace of them. No parish records, no tax rolls, no credible witnesses. In Ireland, the trail was equally strange. County Cork parish registries failed to match their family tree. Even the land they claimed to have farmed didn't exist under their name. Brennan's suspicion hardened. Their history was fabricated. The Donnellys had not simply crossed the ocean to escape hardship. They had erased themselves. Buried in the Ellis Island archives, he found the most damning clue. In 1874, a family named Donnelly had been flagged by a medical inspector, Dr. Samuel Morrison, for developmental irregularities in the children's elongated fingers, asymmetrical features, and unusual speech patterns. Morrison had recommended they be held for examination, but the order was overruled to keep the immigration lines moving. His final notes hinted at more: evasive answers about medical history, aggression when pressed, and a suspicion that the parents were concealing a hereditary condition. Brennan's search widened. Pennsylvania, 1871 Donnelly family, infant deaths unexplained. Ohio, 1873 Donnelly family, investigated for neglect, vanished before charges. Were these all the same bloodline? The record suggested a network, each branch moving like a hunted animal, avoiding authorities, repeating the same patterns. And Montana, with its thin law and vast silence, was the perfect place to vanish again. When the snows began to recede in April, Brennan saddled his horse and took the winding trail north. The journey was grueling narrow paths over rock, swollen creeks, and slopes so steep he wondered how a wagon had ever passed. He saw no other homestead, no smoke. The Donnellys had chosen their land with the precision of men planning an escape route. The cabin appeared neat, industrious. Chickens pecked in the yard. A small garden had been tilled. But behind the house, Brennan stopped cold. 11 small wooden crosses stood in 2 perfect rows. The soil was fresh in places, and nearby trees bore the marks of recent axe work. These graves were not the scattered tragedies of illness or accident. These were prepared, in advance, for children who would never be allowed to live. Patrick answered the door. He looked older than his year's hair, gone completely white, deep lines etched by more than weather. His welcome was forced. "We handle our own troubles," he said when Brennan explained his visit. "Always have." But his voice lacked conviction, and his eyes flickered with something between pride and fear. Bridge emerged from the shadows, thinner than Harrison had described, her face hollow, her hands trembling. She began to speak, but Patrick's sharp glance cut her into silence. Brennan's gaze moved to the children, and it was there that the truth began to uncoil. Moira, barely 18, was visibly pregnant. The timing was impossible for any outsider to be the father. The conception had occurred in the depth of winter, when the family was cut off from the world. Colleen, 16, carried herself with an unnerving maturity, her body showing signs of early hormonal changes. Declan, the youngest, limped heavily, his face uneven, his fingers too long and flexible to be natural. And Seamus, the eldest, could hardly speak without stuttering, his eyes avoiding Brennan's at all costs. Inside, the cabin was divided into too many rooms, each sectioned off by heavy curtains or locked doors. From behind these barriers came muffled sound scraping, shifting, a rhythm that was neither work nor play. There was a medicinal tang in the air, undercut by something organic, something faintly sweet and wrong. As Brennan prepared to leave, Patrick stepped close, his voice low, urgent. "If I told you God tests certain families in ways that require terrible choices, would you understand? Would you help without questions?" Brennan did not answer. Patrick continued. "Our blood carries strength, but also complications. We have methods to manage them, methods outsiders would never understand. In the old country, it worked. Here, people pry." The doctor left with more questions than answers, but with the certainty that whatever methods the Donnellys used, they were not the work of God, but of human hands shaping life and death according to a design too old, too cruel to be spoken aloud. 2 months later, the mountains would send for him again, this time not with whispers, but with a cry for help that would force open the door to the Donnelly family, his most closely guarded secret. It was the first week of July, 1876, when the message arrived. A local trapper rode hard into Helena, sweat-streaked and pale, carrying only a scrap of paper. The words were jagged, hurried. Donnelly woman in bad labor. Family asking for doctor. Something wrong beyond normal birthing troubles. Come quick. Brennan read it twice. The Donnellys had never asked for help. For them to break their wall of secrecy meant something had gone very, very wrong. He left that afternoon, pushing his horse hard over the narrow trails, the heat of midsummer turning the air thick and heavy. By the time he reached the valley, dusk had painted the mountains in bruised purple, and the cabin stood silent but for the muffled groans within. Inside, the air hit him like a wall thick with blood, sweat, and a cloying sweetness that was not natural. Moira lay on a cot in the back room, her skin waxy, her breath ragged. She was in the final throes of labor, but the shapes pressing against the stretched skin of her belly told Brennan this was no ordinary birth. When the moment came, the truth revealed itself in one sickening instant. Twins. Conjoined at the torso, sharing organs, breathing in short, desperate gasps. Brennan's training told him survival was almost impossible without the most advanced surgical care no mountain cabin could provide. But what froze him was not the medical hopelessness. It was the Donnelly reaction. There was no shock, no weeping, no prayers. Patrick and Bridge moved with practiced efficiency, handing instruments, clearing space, their faces grim but unsurprised. Seamus and Colleen fetched cloth and bowls of water, their eyes locked on their parents for silent instruction. This was not a crisis. This was procedure. As Brennan bent over the infants, his foot brushed something under the bed, a bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. Curiosity overpowered caution. When he pulled it free, his hands met leather. Thick journals worn by decades of use. The first page he opened showed a precise anatomical sketch of an infant with a cleft palate. Notes in a mix of English and Gaelic described its unsuitability for survival and a release carried out 3 days after birth. Page after page followed drawings of malformed spines, extra digits, twisted limbs, each with observations and cold assessments. Viability low, remove swiftly, preserve purity. The entries spanned over 50 years, moving from Irish villages to American towns, the dates marching forward alongside the births. Interspersed were crude genealogical charts, linking cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, brothers to sisters. And always the same guiding principle: keep the blood strong, remove the weak. When Bridge saw what he held, she did not snatch it back. Instead, she spoke with the calm of one explaining scripture. Weakness cannot be allowed to spread, Doctor. We learned this long ago. Mercy is for the child and the family. Without it, the bloodline dies in shame. Patrick watched Brennan's face as if weighing whether he could be an ally in this work. Our great-grandfather began the practice, he said quietly. He studied the finest breeders of horses and cattle. 4 generations, it worked children of rare beauty and wit. But some came wrong. Those we set free. It is the Lord's way, though others would not understand. Brennan's stomach turned, but his mind saw the truth in sharp relief. The Donnelly strength was an illusion, the product of an inbreeding spiral that had reached a point of collapse. The surviving children carried hidden damage, physical, mental, that would only worsen with each generation. And now, the conjoined twins gasping on the cot were the purest evidence yet that the experiment had failed. As the night wore on, Brennan fought to keep them alive, but he knew he could not save them. Their shared heart was too weak, their fragile lungs too strained. He stayed by their side until the small hours before dawn, when the weaker twins' breathing stopped, and moments later, the other followed, as if bound together even in death. Patrick stood silent. Bridge closed her eyes, not in grief, but in weary acceptance. Brennan, however, felt something deeper, in anger that cut through the professional detachment he had always prided himself on. He had seen death before, but this was different. This was death as a calculated outcome, generations in the making. What the Donnellys did not yet know was that the twins' passing gave Brennan something he had not possessed before: the legal right to investigate every corner of their property, every record they had kept, every grave behind that cabin. And when he began that work in the coming days, the Donnellys' darkest truths would finally be dragged into the open light. The morning after the twins were buried in the cramped cemetery behind the cabin, Brennan began his work in earnest. Under Montana law, the death of a child, particularly one with obvious deformities, permitted the territorial physician to conduct a full medical inquiry. Patrick watched him from the doorway, his jaw tight, as Brennan paced the small burial ground, counting the crosses. 11 graves. Too many for a family of this size, and far too evenly spaced in time to be the work of random tragedy. The graves told their own story. The soil patterns were wrong-tight, shallow trenches, not the deeper, reverent cuts of a grieving family. Some crosses bore no names, only dates. Others had been carved years before, weathered in ways that suggested they'd been waiting for a body to claim them. Off to one side, Brennan saw bare ground recently cleared, a neat line awaiting more burials. The Donnellys had been preparing for death as part of their household routine. Inside, Brennan laid the journals open on the table, arranging them by date. Decades of cold, meticulous record-keeping unfolded. Birth descriptions, anatomical sketches, assessments of physical and mental suitability, and notes on removal methods. The genealogy charts ran like an unbroken cord through the pages. Cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, sibling to sibling marriages calculated for trait concentration. At first, these unions had produced strong, intelligent offspring. But over time, the defects multiplied. Spinal curvature, cleft palates, asymmetrical skulls, cognitive impairments. The Donnellys' perfected bloodline was rotting from within. Patrick resisted at first, but Brennan pressed him hard. The threat of federal marshals and the word murder finally cracked his composure. Over hours of halting confession, Patrick revealed what had been passed down to him like scripture. In County Cork, his great-grandfather Fergus had believed the Irish could be restored to greatness by controlling their own breeding as farmers did with their finest livestock. Defective offspring were released, spared a life of suffering and the family the shame of weakness. The practice had crossed the ocean intact, adapting only to the legal dangers of the New World. Brennan examined the surviving children with a clinical eye. Seamus's stutter and trembling hands spoke of trauma so deep it had rewired his mind. Moira and Colleen, both physically mature beyond their years, bore the psychological conditioning of breeding stock obedience, suppressed will, and in their eyes, the dull acceptance of a future already chosen. Declan's limp and twisted face marked him as one of the weak who had been allowed to live, perhaps as a test, perhaps as a failure to carry out the old law. His gaze was watchful, mistrustful, and too old for his age. It was Declan who, days later, vanished from custody. He slipped away into the mountains one night, leaving only a trail of disturbed pine needles and the faint smell of wood smoke carried on the wind. No body was ever found. The legal process faltered under the weight of its own limitations. Territorial law had no precedent for prosecuting a century of systematic infanticide and inbreeding. The charges shifted constantly: murder, conspiracy, child abuse, but the evidence was too vast, too alien to fit neatly into court procedure. Both Patrick and Bridge died before a verdict could be reached. Patrick succumbed to a stroke in his cell. Bridge bled to death from yet another malformed stillbirth, her final child, an unbreathing emblem of the family's collapse. Brennan's official reports were clinical, stripped of the worst horrors. But in his private journals, kept under lock until his death, he wrote with haunted precision about what he had seen. The neat rows of graves, the sketches of infants born wrong, the flat voices of children discussing purity as though it were arithmetic. In dreams, he heard the twins' shallow breathing, felt again the weight of their bodies cooling in his hands. The Donnelly homestead was abandoned. Winter reclaimed the fields. The cabin rotted into the ground, its timbers sinking under the snow. Yet the graves remained 11 crosses, perhaps more beneath unmarked earth, standing in rows like teeth in a jaw, the last remains of a bloodline that had consumed itself. Years later, isolated communities elsewhere in America would reveal similar patterns, families living beyond the reach of law, convinced that human worth could be measured, improved, purified. The Donnelly case would be cited as early proof of the genetic ruin wrought by inbreeding, its shadow stretching into debates over marriage laws and child protection. But for Brennan, and for the handful who had seen the truth firsthand, it was something darker than science. It was a warning that the desire for perfection, when pursued without compassion, without restraint, will always rot into something monstrous. And that in the right kind of silence, In the deep winters of forgotten valleys, monsters can thrive for generations before anyone dares to look. Even now, when the snow falls heavy in those mountains, locals say you can see faint lights where the cabin once stood. And if the wind cuts just right, you might hear it the thin cry of an infant carried far across the frozen dark. And then, suddenly silence.